Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
So as I was saying today at the Stoa, we have Rafe Kelly, and Rafe is a movement educator. He creates retreats called Return to the Source, and he's personally inspired me to have a deeper appreciation of the way that I move in the natural world, participate in my environment, the environment around me that I'm living with. In Hawaii, I climbed up a tree and actually fell from a tree on an adventure with Rafe and a bunch of people. And since then, some of the lessons, it seems funny to say that because it's like, yeah, Rafe was teaching me movement and I fell out of a tree. But really, like in that moment, like I had a really gracious fall and I fell quite comfortably. And it's actually inspired me to take more like risks in the way that I move. Although it was scary, it was enlivening. And it gave me this opportunity to like see how dangerous like climbing a tree and playing like that can be. But it also like dialed my attention into another dimension of like, I don't want that to happen again. And so what that has done is when I've been climbing a tree, like allowing myself to be very thoughtful in the way that I do it. And I mean, ultra mindful. And so that's just one thing. Anytime I think of Rafe, I remember the time that I fell out of a tree. And I also think that of my appreciation of how that didn't keep me from continuing to want to climb and take risks with the way that I move my body, but to do so with my attention dialed up. So anyway, Rafe, thank you for being here at the Stoa.
Absolutely. I'm pleased to be here.
Wonderful. So we titled this session Play and Meaning Making, particularly because I'm very enthusiastic about play. And I'm very interested in how play and movement in the body can inform my sense making. Yeah. And a lot of my sense making, what I call sense making, right, has been happening like in this container specifically, like in a Zoom room with a bunch of people that are very smart, have great intellect, speak eloquently, and what I see is like their shoulders up. Yeah. And that's often also when I look at myself, that's what I see. And like my even feedback of like myself is often like what's going on from my shoulders up. So part of what was like, I'm most excited to have you here and talking with us, what I'm most curious about is how play and movement in the body, how we can bring that into this conversation and into this practice and what we're doing when we're doing sense making and meaning making. So I'm curious any thoughts that you have on that to kind of start us off. And then as we go, anyone that has questions, please drop them in the chat and then we'll have an opportunity for you to ask those.
So just as a note, is anyone else having trouble with Tyson's feed? I'm just getting a little bit, it's lagging for me. Is it just me? So I'm just trying to figure out if it's on my end. So if you can drop a comment, because I might have a hard time sometimes with the questions if that's a problem. So but yeah, so a couple things there. One was essentially how do we bring the body back into this question, back into the culture of whatever it is that we're creating, right? I think in some sense we're wrestling with the death of Christianity or the resurrection of Christianity, depending on your perspective. But the meaning making, the central organizing narrative of the West was for a long time based around Christianity. And then that was destabilized. This is, Nietzsche's great critique of Christianity. But one thing that was interesting about Nietzsche is that one of the things that he really wanted people to say, wanted people to do, was to sort of recover the body, right? The Christianity, a tradition that was very anti-body, and to this day, I think we're still kind of stuck in this DNA where we think of our bodies as kind of separate from ourselves. So I'll try to come back to a tighter version of this point because I think this is a really useful thing to think about. But you talked about sense making, right? And meaning making. Well, how does one make sense? One actually has to move. And what is meaning? Meaning is in some sense relevance to movement. So J.J. Gibson, who is the founder of ecological psychology, he made this very important point, which is when we perceive, right, sense, at the most basic level, what sense making is being able to make sense of the world around us. And we use our senses to do that. But in order to use our senses, we actually have to use movement. Our eyes have to be moving constantly in order to generate a picture of the world around us. We have to move around to try to pick up sense. We move to hear, right? Our kinesthetic structure, receptive senses are all dependent on movement. Your sense of where you are in the world, of how you inhabit your body, this is all related to movement. And then many of you guys are probably inspired by or aware of the work of Jordan Peterson. And if you pick up his magnum opus, Maps of Meaning, what he says in the first paragraph, more or less, is that we can look at the world in two ways. One is as a world of objects, and the other is as a forum for action. Action meaning movement, right? And the second way of viewing the world is the view of the world that came from traditional religion, that came from traditional sense-making structures, that is embedded in literature, that is embedded in storytelling, that is embedded in flow. And that's the world of meaning, right? And what is the meaning that they're talking about? Well, the meaning is relevance to action. So Peterson, who was, of course, one of the biggest influencers to many of us in the world of thinking about sense-making, in the beginning of his book, he's saying that what makes something make sense, what makes something have meaning, is its ability to guide you into being able to act. And unfortunately, as a culture, we have neglected a huge percentage of the self that is relevant to that. So, in Thus Spake Zarathustra, Nietzsche talks about the intellectual as a shriveled, atrophied man with a giant ear, right? And if we think about John Vervaeke, who many of you guys in here are big fans of as well, talks about this 4 ways of knowing: propositional, procedural, perspectival, and participatory, right? Everyone's aware of these, hopefully, in this chat. So when you sit down and you consume Wikipedia articles, or you watch YouTube videos, or you listen to podcasts, what we're doing right now is propositional, right? And what we're doing is we are feeding this part of ourselves, the part of us that absorbs and becomes better at juggling semantic propositions. But your ability to actually achieve anything in the world is always, more than that. We have to have procedure, right? So you have to actually be able to act something out. You have to be able to do it. I can tell you how to do a movement. I can give you words, but it doesn't mean that you can do the movement. It doesn't mean that you understand what the world looks like and understanding how to apply that movement. It doesn't mean that you understand how that movement has shifted your role in your relationship with the world. So we need movement. So that's a good place to start.
Yeah, that's really good. I've been doing a weekly session here called Flowing with Unknowingness, where we practice freestyle and do a dialogue, have a conversation with beats playing.
Nice.
And there's something about the freestyle that catalyzes for me, like moving my hands and my arms and bringing in this like rhythmic movement while I'm speaking. And even just noticing how that influences the space and like the capacity of the group to create a story together and sort of let that dialect, or I don't know what to call it, but let the dialogue kind of guide the conversation. There's something about the movement that is very helpful to allowing what we might call like emergence or presencing. So I think what I'm interested in is how, when we're doing dialogue, we're doing storytelling, how does, and in your experiences, because you really bring like the dialogue practices and storytelling together with movement for groups of people out in the wilderness. So I'm interested in how our movement informs our capacity to like do dialogue and allow what some call like regenerative, emergent, presencing type of conversation, this generative conversation, and how might we continue to practice bringing more of that movement and that rhythm into dialogues like this.
Yeah. First thing that occurs to me when you're talking about that is, I'm curious, everyone in the chat, if you were also at the Embodied Movement Summit that we just put on, drop a little check mark in the chat. I'm curious how many of you guys were there. But my friend Simon Thacker did a really wonderful presentation on the role of dance and gesture in the origin of communication, right? So his theory is that the human ability to mimic and create expressive movement actually preceded our ability to have articulated language, and that we have this incredible ability to express empathy for other animals. And we know that when we're more passionate, when we're more articulate, we use our hands more, we use our gestures more. So the part of you that generates speech, which is very closely related to the part of you that can generate articulated thought, is motorically linked to your ability to gesture. And so we might then think that fluidity in those things is somewhat interrelated. So here's one way in which we can think that this is a way of better integrating the self. One of my big sort of passions is this idea that that a lot of things that are often seen as in opposition to each other are actually meant to be integrated. That doesn't mean it's easy to integrate them, but we grow through integration, right? We need to be able to express masculinity. We need to be able to express femininity, right? And there's immature femininity and immature masculinity. And then there's an integrated, appropriately balanced for you as an individual, mature expression of those things, right? Right? You have to be able to be assertive, and you also have to be able to be compassionate. And in the same way, the mind and the body have to be expressed, and they have to be better integrated. So when we have our events, we go out and we run and jump and climb and roughhouse, and we experience intense physicality, and we experience fear, and we experience joy, and we experience pleasure physically, and then we talk about it, right? We insight generate off of it, and we ask people to tell stories. So for instance, this year we asked everyone to tell a story of their day as an individual, right? So one day we went and had a crazy epic adventure, and then we asked people, okay, what would this story sound like if it was still remembered 1,000 years from now, right? It had been turned into this epic adventure that was meaningful for people 1,000 years from now. Well, how would you tell that story, right? How would it have been shifted? And then the next night we had them join in little tribes and do the same exercise. So what we can is engaging in sense making, as you said, engaging in building our capacity for articulation, but we're intentionally linking physical action. We're intentionally linking physical culture into the rest of our culture. We talk about this, this balance between 4 pillars of self-development. I'm not claiming that these pillars are exhaustive, but I think they're a very good start. And those are, you need a movement practice, you need a mindfulness practice, you need a nature connection practice, and you need community practices. Right? If you have those things, you're going to be doing pretty well. So what we notice is that each of these things grounds and affords greater transformation through each other. So for instance, many people struggle when starting a meditation practice. Sitting down and concentrating on your breath can be very difficult to do. However, I believe that if you have that same person doing parkour or martial arts, and you point out to them their ability to stay in flow and focused and not be distracted while they're participating in the sport, it will ground and they will see the benefits of the meditation much earlier. And they will, in fact, get the benefits faster because they're going to be doing two things that teach you how to access the flow state at the same time. So I know that when I don't concentrate, I fall, or when I don't have a way of specifically training concentration, all of a sudden these two things are relevant to each other, and then they're mutually intra-affording and causing transformation. And then we could look at something like time in nature, same thing, right? I have a nature meditation practice of sitting and listening to tune out everything else in my life and be able to actually listen to the birds is dependent on my ability to have good concentration. But those birds are way more interesting and informational, right? And they add so much richness. And then, of course, when I have a movement practice, all these things become the place where I can have real dialogue and real stories with the people in my life, right? So how many conversations have you had about the weather? Those can be very, very meaningless, but actually they can be very, very meaningful when you're a surfer or a canyoneer, right? How many conversations have you had about the latest TV show, the latest, how much more meaningful is it in your life when you're talking about, I did this crazy jump, I had this amazing sparring session, versus these things happened on a Game of Thrones, right? So we think that in this, we actually think the movement is primary, right? That it's the first place that we should go. That play is the first place that we should go, because fundamentally cognition and everything else about us and language, right? Our ability to speak, this dialoguing we're doing right now, it is movement. Out movement patterns in our head. We don't have a good relationship with ourselves and our body. I think we're in our body's embeddedness in the environment. I think it really weakens our ability to pursue any of these other things that we're looking to pursue. There's actually one of my students, Robert Lansdale, who pointed out something I really liked. Jordan Peterson, who we mentioned before, famously says, if you would change the world, first clean your own room. And he said, but there's actually something closer to you than your room, right? It's your body, right? Do you have your relationship to your own body and its capacity to move and express itself and connect to the world around it? Is that in order? And if that's disordered, if you're deeply uncomfortable, insecure, fearful in your body, are you really going to be able to go out and effectively change the world in a powerful way? So hopefully that was helpful, Tyson. I got on a little rant there, but let me know where you want to go from there.
Yeah, great. As you guys have questions, please drop them in the chat. I'm going to ask another question. I'm going to go to a question I got via email. So my curiosity now is guiding principles for developing a movement practice. I think it's an interesting opportunity right now because gyms closed. People started spending a lot more time outside. Like the campgrounds and parks around here have been crazy packed. Like everyone's out there. So I think there's an interesting opportunity in people discovering new ways to move and be embodied. So what are some guiding principles for developing a good movement practice that will work in synergy with that ecology of practices?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I want to do a little exercise, right? Let's get a little bit more embodied here.
Cool.
So the breath is always something very powerful to go back to. And even if you're, in solitary confinement, you can play with it. So we're here, we're in a very cognitive space. Let's tune into our body for a second. Notice if you're breathing into your belly, into your chest, up into your clavicles. Notice if the sides of your belly are expanding. Notice if the back of your body is. Is there tension anywhere that you're holding with the breath? When we live very cognitively stressful lives. And any time that we want to go into the body and be with the body, a very basic starting place can be, how is my breath? Right? So I personally notice a feeling of tension in my chest right now. Got a lot of work stress at the moment, and I think that's where it's expressing. So I'll kind of ask my body, is there tension here that I can release, that I don't need? And can I return to a breath that involves the belly, the chest, all the way up a little bit? With a pause, both at the top of the inhale, and most importantly, at the bottom of the exhale. You're always switching between a sympathetic state, right? Fight, flight, fight or freeze, or a parasympathetic state. Rest, digest, breathe, and even the breath cycle has this yin and yang aspect to it. Breathing in is yang, breathing out is yin, it's parasympathetic. And the pause at the bottom of our exhale is actually the most parasympathetic place. So when we can extend our exhale and extend that time without stress, not forcing it, but just allowing there to be a longer pause, it teaches our body to settle into our parasympathetic. So now, if there's anywhere outside that you can take a look and just observe nature. For me, my movement practice, the origins of my movement practice come from nature. I was a kid who grew up at the end of a dirt road that's been in my family since 1920. It was homesteaded. And I spent many, many years walking through the woods and then jumping and climbing and roughhousing with my friends. And in some ways, I'm just doing more sophisticated versions of that now. And I find that whenever my practice becomes oppressive, or I'm tyrannical with myself, or I'm overstressed and my body isn't feeling good, and I need some way to reset, that simply walking in the woods is the best way to do that. So we're not going to get up and take a walk, but we can imagine what it would be like if we just stepped outside our door. And here in Washington right now, the sun's shining. It's a beautiful day. It's a blue sky. It's birds. How would it be to settle in and walk through those woods, right? To be in that nature. And as I'm walking, when you first start walking in the woods, maybe you just walk, but you might find a fallen log and want to climb across it. You might see a low hanging limb and want to hang from it. Every child has this inherent capacity, and they'll explore their environment. And all of us still have that inside ourselves. We just have to learn to let go of the social conditioning that says that it's not okay. We have to see the world as a forum for action that we're not constrained from. So, we have whole programs. We have lots of ways of building up the skills. There's millions of free tutorials on any physical skill you want on YouTube. There's a lot of stuff out there. But for me, fundamentally, go outside, horse, time, breathe, be with nature. That's how you get started.
Perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to get to some of the questions. And then we got some more moving in now. Danny, you sent me a question. I would love for you to unmute yourself and ask it if you'd like.
Yeah, by memory. I just came across someone, I don't know if you're familiar with Gurdjieff, he's this spiritual mystic from the 30s, 20s, and whatever. Anyway, this phrase that he said was that our consciousness, our spirit needs us to feed our senses.
Mm-hmm.
And how he took that was that we needed to get ourselves in new environments so that it sparked it. But it seems like your work is about seeing what's here just in a new way, that's going to feed our senses. It's going to change our perspective and I just like that phrase, feed the senses. Yeah. And that we forget to do that, really. Mm-hmm. Or we use, television to do that.
Yeah. Oh man, that reminds me of Khalil Gibran, the prophet.
Exactly.
The earth longs to feel your feet upon it, to caress it. Right. The wind longs to caress you. There's another wonderful book. So Khalil Gibran, the prophet, is a really wonderful book. Another one is called The Spell of the Sensuous by David Abrams. But it's basically about the idea that fundamentally we are supposed to be phenomenologically expressed through our senses, and that we have become blind to the senses in some sense, and we've become illiterate. Had this image the other day that a modern Westerner walking through nature is like someone who couldn't read walking through the Library of Alexandria. Right? There's so much signal, and you're completely blind to it. Rafe has introduced me to 4E cognitive science, right? We have embodiment, right? And now embodiment is this big word that's becoming a major sort of organizing principle around how we can do sense making and how we can grow and how we can gain meaning in our lives. But there's also embeddedness, right? So a cognitive agent has to essentially be in something that has motor capacity in order to form its cognition. Cognition is bootstrapped off of motor capacity. But it's not just that you have a body, it's that the body only exists in relationship to an environment. It's embedded in the environment, right? And then cognition is enacted. You have to actually act things out in order to organize and grow. And then you have to, and then it's extended, right? That's the community aspect. We have to be connected into a network of other people. So the way that this is a very old debate, right, in philosophy. It goes back to Plato and before Plato. But I really like not the Platonic viewpoint, but the other viewpoint, which is that the world is always changing, right? I can't remember who it was. It was a famous philosopher. It was kind of he was opposed to Plato's ideal of performance, but he said, a man never steps in the same river twice, because the river is always changing, and so is the man or woman. And we, right, like I walk by a tree and I think, oh, that tree looks kind of interesting. And then maybe I don't know what kind of tree it is. And then maybe I learn some other trees and I realize, oh, that's a Portuguese laurel tree. And I play in it and I see certain things in it. And then I exhaust those things and I don't see it. And then years later, I come back to those same trees and I say, oh, wow, now there's a bunch of new things here. And it slowly reveals itself to me, and new layers of meaning are possible. And that's through the parkour practice, but also like I could learn about the value of the wood in that tree and how it's used and how it reacts to fire or how it is used in carpentry. Or I can know what kind of birds feed on the berries of that tree, or whether they're edible for human beings, or what season the tree flowers in, and what animals are attracted to those flowers, what insects. So there's this, there's an inexhaustibleness to the natural world where you can observe the same area over and over again and always be coming back to a new country, always be revealing new vistas to yourself. And this is very closely connected to, this is essentially what Vervaeke describes as the sacred, those things that are inexhaustibly revealing themselves to you that you can always learn from. I think of the trees that I train always have a new lesson for me every time that I come back. So yeah, that's how I do it.
And that's the sacred. I mean, that's when you're making that link, that's gorgeous. Huh.
Yeah, it's how I view the sacred. Yes.
Yeah, it's lovely. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thanks, Danny. Peter, will you ask your question?
How's it going, Rafe?
Peter, nice to meet you. Or
Yeah, nice to meet you, man. Welcome to the Stoa. It's good to have you here. So my question was, I know you're Peterson and Viveki have been an influence on you. And they're like top heavy, a lot of propositional heavy content that they're throwing out there. And I wonder how that's shaped and informed your understanding of your own embodied movement practices and maybe how you went about them differently.
Yeah, that's a big question. I could do like a very long presentation on the influence of those two thinkers. So I'm going to try to see how short I can make it. I guess one way to think about it is that physical cultures have an inherent meaning system that may not be explicitly prescribed, right? Or explicitly explained, right? I actually think that I think there's some very deep cultural DNA, for instance, in a lot of our physical culture that comes out of the period of romanticism and nationalism. Because gymnastics, for instance, was formed around the same time as like Pan-Aryan German nationalism by people who were deeply involved in it, right? Gymnastics our way, Germanness our way was like the original founding of that. And rugby, soccer, tennis, cricket, all these games were codified during the height of the British Empire. And later they said that the battle of Waterfield was won upon the fields of Eton, right, which is the famous British boarding school. The idea being that the culture of these young soldiers had been formed by these games that had been created. And so there's all these interesting things that come out of that. And I think that parkour was a kind of emergent culture that came out of this basically a very deeply traumatized group of immigrant kids, right? Parkour is formed in the ghettos of Paris, the banlieues of Paris, by kids who a lot of them are mixed Vietnamese. Their families escaped Vietnam during the Franco-Vietnamese War. Some of them, one of them was from New Caledonia, other ones are from West Africa. And these kids, they basically were, the type of kids who might have ended up in gangs. They were struggling in school, and they wanted to test themselves and see how they could become strong human beings. And so they test themselves with how many push-ups can we do? How many pistol squats can we do? How many, how far can we jump? All these things. And then those movements, some of the movements that they did were picked up and spread across the world through YouTube. And so we kind of got only a small piece of it. And then we were trying to replicate it. And it was very meaningful for me in the beginning, but eventually it was like I couldn't figure out some of the pieces. And I started to sort of pull in culture, sense making from like the elite sports world, right? From track and field gymnastics. And so I got very into like being very goal oriented and having very clear progressions and creating competitions. And there are some aspects of that were great. But ultimately it didn't take me where I needed to go. And I got injured a lot, and it was a kind of a game that was self-extinguishing. So then I got really interested in play, and play was very powerful, and it took me in a very good direction. I exploded in a lot of ways. I was in nature all the time, and I really enjoyed it. But there was a point at which I could feel that I was sort of becoming too disorganized. There wasn't enough structure. There wasn't enough clarity about where I was going. And I was starting to articulate this idea that I wanted that there was something bigger than just being the best athlete and from a technical perspective or winning a competition that we had to be oriented towards. And I wrote a piece called The Self-Worth Esteeming, which was about this idea that it's no good to try to just love yourself as you are. You actually have to start cultivating the self in a way that you will admire into the future. And I also had noticed at that time that people were very interested in the stories that I was telling, rather than the kind of statistical scientific knowledge that I had. And I was trying to understand the value of narrative and story. And that's, and I listened to the political aspect of that, and it was interesting, but as soon as he got into the archetypal stuff, I was really hooked. So I went and watched the whole Maps of Meaning series from 2017, the whole personality series. And then I was kind of confused though, because I didn't know exactly why I was paying so much attention to this when it didn't seem to be really deeply related to the work that I was doing. Because before that, I was spending lots of time on gymnastics and strength and conditioning and track and field podcasts. And then I went to teach a workshop. It was my first workshop of the year because I spent about 4 months off the road between the fall and the spring. And I started telling my stories and my anecdotes about evolution and how that was related to how we became better human movers. And all of a sudden, this Petersonian perspective would just sort of assert itself. And I would say, oh, wow, boom, this is the same thing, same thing, same thing. And then I sort of had this realization that his project of, helping people recognize how to create the most heroic version of themselves in a way was essentially what I'd been doing at just a different level. I'd been doing it with the body. And then I ran into Vervaeke's work, and Vervaeke just gave me so much deeper insight into that and different ways of looking at that, right? Looking at his self-transcendence versus the creation of the heroic self, thinking about the 4 E's, the 4 P's of knowledge. I sometimes think, I told Vervaeke this, that like, Jordan's work like built so much cognitive architecture in my brain that it was kind of hard to get to move it around. And so it was like he created more of the base for me to interact with John's work with. But now I kind of think of like Jordan's work as like being and Vervaeke's work is more like an ether that's sifting through everything and shifting it. It feels like go is happening in my brain, if that makes sense. So I don't know if that is a completely coherent story, but I've found, even though both those guys are heady, it's kind of interesting because Jordan talks a lot about rough and tumble play. That was one place that I really was interested in. And that's one of the conversations that I really like to have with him. And in his own story, when he sort of made himself right, he got into strength training, right? And he has a chapter in his book called Don't Bother Children When They're Skateboarding. So when I met Jordan, we talked about parkour. And, he was super into it. He was super excited about what was happening in the parkour world. And then with John, he's a Tai Chi Chuan practitioner, right? He wants to come to return to the source. And he's just sort of like, as soon as we've had a conversation, he's been incredibly passionate about sort of forwarding what I'm talking about into this world because he sees it as a big missing piece.
Cool, that was awesome. Thank you.
Megan, will you ask your question about education?
Thanks for all the thoughts so far. This has been really interesting. I'm a music teacher. I started with one child at once, teaching them the violin and asking them to stand up straight and put their feet on the ground and play the violin and focus for 20 minutes. And then I worked into teaching in quite big groups, mostly 5 to 10-year-olds. And I've been getting more and more interested in what's going on in mainstream education as well. And so personally, I'm trying to really break out of the idea where we ask the kids to switch off from the rest of their bodies. And so in the case of violin, it's fingertips only and arms, and ignore the rest of the body. So personally, I'm trying to break out of that idea. So I'm really interested in what's going on in mainstream education, which is often seeing the idea that kids need to move their bodies as a kind of obstacle that we need to overcome. And for example, there are these web services that produce short movement videos designed to splice in between your maths lesson and your English lesson in class to get all the kids, you know, standing up and wiggling around for 5 minutes, and then they can sit down and put their heads down and do their maths. Which seems like it's a very separatist way of solving that problem, is, you know, splice in this little 5 minutes of movement in between the cognitive tasks that cut off the body completely. So I'm wondering if you know of any positive movements going on in children's education, any people who are doing some interesting work with integrating those things together, that you could point us to or speak on?
I have a few thoughts there. So the first thing that pops into my brain is my friend Kelly Storrett, who runs the Ready State. He's a pretty big name in the strength and conditioning world. He and his wife have a program called Stand Up Kids, and it is basically they're replacing sit-down desks with stand-up desks, but they have a kind of special feature, which is that they have a bar on the bottom of them that the kids can put their feet on that wiggles. So it's basically a wiggle channeling device, let's call it. But they found that when they did this, kids way more callous, they were healthier, they're more engaged in school. You know, many people have observed that walking actually helps us. So if we need to think about something difficult, going on a walk can be a very good thing. So in the same sense, you might find that creating these stand-up desks that have this capacity to wiggle actually helps kids learn better. Did you guys all get that? I know my internet just went unstable, it said. Give me a thumbs up.
Yep, we got that.
Cool. And then, so the next thing that occurs to me that's interesting is, I mean, in a sense, music education is physical. It is a movement, right? You are learning to control. It's motor control versus, say, gross motor control, like I might be more focused on. But the same type of principles apply. So I would be looking for thinkers who are applying ecological dynamics and constraint-led approach learning and external cue learning to the movement space. I think that would be very interesting. I know that I've run into a few things where learning music is very closely related to the type of things that we're finding are effective in learning, right? So a lot of traditional movement practice is part practice, where you're breaking things down into very small pieces and trying to build them up. And we've done the same thing in physical pedagogy. And in both, it appears that generally learning is optimized when you actually try to take on bigger chunks. And then there's a whole breakdown of that, basically having to do with optimizing cognitive difficulty. And so the level of challenge that you want is variable, and you have to look at the teaching effect versus the session effect. So a really interesting finding from motor learning theory is that there's a pretty strong disjunction between what's called the session result, which is how much someone improves in a session, and the teaching result, which is how much that improvement is retained from session to session. So very often, what's called blocked practice, like you practice this scale, then this scale, then this scale, outperforms in session result, but underperforms in like long-term result compared to actually playing the whole song and just playing the whole song repeatedly, even though you make errors. So I hope those are interesting thoughts, but yeah, Stand Up Kids is great for general stuff. And then I agree with you that having kids just move and then just do cognition is not the best way to do it. That if we can integrate these two things, if we can have them, say, play soccer and then explore what soccer informs them about geometry, that we're going to get a better result, right? A lot of this learning that I've done around statistics and math has been about just trying to understand all the physical stuff that I want to do. Lots of snowboarders, skateboarders have gotten really good at geometry, and because, you know, that's how they figure out how to make these giant jumps and how to jump on them and not die. So I think there's a lot of kids who would improve much faster if we could leverage some of these things. Hopefully that was helpful.
Mark, would love to have you ask your question.
Sure. So I was wondering if you noticed anything with shifts in perspective from people who go through your course, and what kind of shifts they might have as a result of spending time in the woods with you, et cetera.
There's lots of shifts in perspective, right? So very often people, when they look at physical practices, experience a lot of fear and trepidation going into the practice. And they find through the practice that they're more capable than they realized, they're more robust than they realized, and their sense of empowerment and overcoming fear, and their relationship to fear changes dramatically. Also, obviously, their relationship to nature changes. They see nature differently. They see the natural world differently. And then with our longer retreats, there's a massive shift for people in how they perceive relationships and what is possible for them in relationships, and how they can communicate with other people, how they want to be communicated with, how much intimacy they're actually missing in their lives, and how much that sense of intimacy, that sense of being meaningful to other people, that sense of having experiences that are deeply meaningful, that are part of a group. I don't know that I feel like there's so many changes of perspective that it would be really difficult to articulate them all. But I guess one way to think about it is, we talk about this idea, there's reconnections, right? That people are disconnected and alienated as a kind of default state in the modern Western world. And they're disconnected and alienated from knowing who they are and what they want and what is meaningful to them. Because we have a kind of educational system that's focused on extrinsic rewards, followed by a professional world that's largely driven by extrinsic rewards. And without access to play, it can become very easy to be unaware of what is intrinsic. Know what you like, you don't know what actually motivates you, then you just don't know who you are. So we reconnect with the self. Obviously, we move from a kind of very cognitive oriented style of engaging with the world towards a more body oriented style of engaging with the world. So we shift perspective from mental to physical in a way. We change our story around play and the meaning of play, and that's very powerful. And we change our story and our perspective around nature, and then obviously, as I said, on community. And what we find is that people find those transformations incredibly meaningful and powerful. So we're really motivated to try to get more people to experience them.
Awesome. Personally, in one of my experiences with Rafe, he guided a group of us through moving with each other by actually like grabbing each other's heads. And there's a specific way to safely grab onto someone's head and actually guide them around and move their body. And it was amazing for me to realize, well, one thing, the level of surrender that I could feel in the hands of another person that I wasn't expecting. Like, I thought it would be tense and rigid and scared. And so one shift for me was realizing like how relaxing it was to be like dragged around by my head in a way. And then the other was to realize that how to do that. And we had others where we'd grab at their arm or different things, but to realize how foreign another person's body felt to me. And how I didn't like that. Like, it was like, it revealed something to me where I was like, oh, there's a lot of opportunity for me here. Like, another person's body feels like off limits to touch, which there are reasons for that, and consent and all that is very important. But to realize how interesting a body is and how I want to be able to move with another body, that was, I mean, that's definitely something that's stuck with me, and like created a curiosity that's led me to yeah, like to connect with people in a way that maybe my words and my language in the past has fallen short. Yeah, and how that intimacy in my life typically has been saved for a very small group of people. But there is something that opens up with a person in the way we can communicate and understand each other and team up when there are other pathways for intimacy. Yeah, so I felt inspired to share that. And I would love to hear Robert ask his question.
Sorry, I was sitting in the dark. I didn't want to seem too creepy when I turned everything on. So my question, I'll just read it. The body is kind of universal and can transcend everything and be a frame big enough for kind of all of us on the planet. So do you have any insights or anecdotes into how like your philosophy can create a common ground or like surprising relationships? And surprising could be like negative or anything. It doesn't mean good necessarily.
Yeah. The first thing that occurs to me is actually that, like, I would describe myself as a pretty hyper-masculine individual without a lot of connection to the feminine necessarily, and I can find female minds to be pretty and through teaching and sharing these things, I've had lots of really wonderful opportunities to be able to see the world from a woman's perspective and to draw value from that and to grow from it. So I feel like it's easier for me to teach, you know, kind of the easiest population for me to teach is like 15 to 22-year-old hyper athletic males, right? They just kind of see the same way that I do, you know, will be loud and abrasive and push each other around a lot and domineering, and it's great. But I learn a lot more when I work with female students, and I really enjoy that. So I'll tell you guys a little story about that. When I first started teaching parkour, we were doing a lot of really intense conditioning as part of our training. So for instance, we'd say, okay, we're only going to do 10 push-ups, but every push-up would take like 60 seconds and we'd be in like 30 different positions. And then almost everyone would fail by the time that we got through these 10 push-ups. And then we'd do the same thing for squats, and then we'd go for a run. Pretty much every female student that I'd had in the class had cried. One another, and a number of years. So I was pretty alarmed by this. And I would kind of become obviously alarmed by it apparently during class and would sort of give too much attention to the person who was crying, which generally only made it worse. And so I had one of our apprentices, who was a woman, come to me and say, like, you may not have cried in several years, but these women you're responding to probably cry pretty regularly, so you just need to relax and not make such a big deal out of it. And so I did, and sure enough, like, they pretty much just stopped crying in most of my classes, and the problem resolved itself. Now, a few years later, I was at Return to the Source, our big event, and one of our students was up ahead of me on the creek. We were running down Wacom Creek, and she had come up to a jump between two boulders over a waterfall. And one of the other students, who is also a coach, was telling her that she could do it. Right? You can do this. Like, absolutely, you can do this. You know, he's encouraging her to get ready for this jump. And I saw that she was physically capable of doing the jump. But I ran up and I didn't want her to feel too pressured, right? I didn't want her to feel like she had to do the jump in order to be accepted as part of the group. So I said, like, I know that you can do this jump, and I'm here to support you if you want to do this jump, but you don't have to do the jump. It's your choice. And she asked me, is it okay if I cry while I do the jump? And I said, yeah, absolutely. Jump, right? Like, whatever is your own process, your own way of doing it, you do that. And so she did the jump. And she was crying. And when she landed on the other side, she was still crying, and she was laughing, and she was crying. And we walked away and we talked about how that was good, and that was powerful, and it was wonderful, and it was great. And so that's become a big story about what we learned from these things. Now, the story continues because Maura now has come back to Return to the Source more often than any other student. She's been there for 5 years in a row. And she kind of cringes when I tell this story because she doesn't cry anymore. And she does pretty crazy things. Right? This year she jumped off a 30-foot cliff for the first time. Last year she did a backflip off of a rope swing for the first time. But without the education that Janine gave me, I wouldn't have been ready in the moment for Maura. And so that was a connection and awareness that has been really powerful. And I've also seen, I've seen lots of beautiful moments like that. We, year before last, or 2019, we had sometimes conversations around gender, sexuality, violence can come up around the rough and tumble play that we do. That can be a very revealing place for people. And people had that come up, and we had some folks in the group who were women who were traumatized and had a history of trauma and had adopted a very strong kind of anti-patriarchy belief system. But it turned out we also had men in the group who had been abused by ex-girlfriends and men who'd been raped by women. And that came out in the process of and it was really powerful because there were women in the group who didn't know beforehand that such a thing could happen to a man, or didn't have a felt sense that that was possible, and didn't really have any empathy for that idea in a man. But when they saw these very strong, very capable men talk about this experience, it changed things for them. And at the same time, for those men to be witnessed by women who they might have thought of as their ideological enemies in their vulnerability, and not to be attacked for it and not to be looked down on for it, was incredibly powerful and healing. So that's that's my best answer to that question.
Thank you. Well, that brings us through a full hour. We do have a couple questions in here. Rafe, do you have time for a question or two more, or must we let you go?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer some more questions.
Wonderful. Well, Monique, I would love to have you ask your question.
You have to unmute yourself, Monique.
Okay, hi, thanks for everything you shared so far. I was wondering, because of the whole the need for more embodied work in usual sessions of co-working or collaboration or thinking together in groups, but now we're in this long lockdown and we've got the places like the store and many other places where we're mostly stuck behind screens and will be for a while, and whether you have thoughts about that, the kind of embodied culture we need to start, or tactics we need to start introducing in our sessions, these long-term virtual sessions that we probably will be in.
Yeah. I was introduced to this idea recently of strong versus weak connection. And I think it's a really powerful way to think about the information ecologies that we're experiencing, right? Like how much bandwidth, how much information am I receiving from you as I'm looking at you on the screen? And so one thing that I've noticed personally is that, like, text, Twitter, Facebook, they're, you can do a lot of it's very hard to get good communication to happen. So I think that this is a wonderful thing, because essentially, like, we are taking social media and we're making it much more real in a way. Now, I've noticed an interesting thing, which is that people know me from my movement work, and they often ask me to come on and do some kind of movement thing on a call like this. And I always find that really uncomfortable, because my movement work involves being out there in nature, right? So it's like, everybody pull up their tree and let's all swing around on it. Doesn't work so well. Or everybody start wrestling with your partner. Doesn't work so well on this type of frame. But I do like this. But I think as I was talking today, I had this sense of like, oh, we need to do something, right? And I think just breathing was a really good place to start, right? Like sitting here and all trying to breathe together, right? that's another level of physical connection, right? There's a physical intimacy that comes through that. And obviously we could do basic physical exercises together, and we could play with rhythm together. Or, as Tyson might have you guys do, there's a beat, and we're all experiencing the same beat, and we're all responding to the same beat, and we're all moving to the same beat. And all these things can increase our kinesthetic empathy for each other. So those are some ideas I think that would be useful as games involve rhythm, that involve movement, that connect us.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Excellent. We have a question from Connor also.
Yep.
Hey, Rafe.
Yeah.
Good to see you. So I was wondering, what would you think of that potential for augmented reality, especially if it's outdoors or shared with other people, as it gets better for combining like the aspirational and imaginative qualities of video games, along with their capacity for inducing flow states with an appreciation for nature and athletics, especially something like Pokemon Go, if it got better for affording like a new kind of animism that helps people care more about the ecology as well?
Yeah. It's an interesting question. Does that return to the source with us? So nice to see you, Connor. I know that you're a pretty big video game player, is what it sounds like. And a lot of people who follow me are and love video games. And I tend to have a pretty negative relationship to video games personally. So to back up, so there's a video that I recorded a few years ago that has me climbing through a waterfall, right? And it's the same waterfall that we climbed through at Return to Source. And when I showed that video to my dad said, "Wow, Rafe, it must have been real scary climbing up through that waterfall. We only ever climbed down," you know? So this waterfall is 45 minutes away from where my dad grew up, in a different town, buried in the very hard to access area of this park. And somehow as a kid, he'd found it and climbed it. And that was an expression of the type of thing that my dad did as a kid, right? They built 70-foot rope swings. My dad learned how to do back handsprings and front handsprings in PE class. And when he was like 46 or 7 years old, he built a diving board on our property into a new pond that he'd built. And I was hanging out with him at the time, and he started bouncing on the diving board, and he went up and he did a front flip into a dive. And I'd never seen him do a flip in my entire life. And he just pulled it out, and it was beautiful and perfect the first time he did it. And, you know, when I started doing parkour, you know, I started hearing all these stories from people who had been kids with my dad about the way that he used to run and jump and climb through the woods and slide out of cedar trees. And that's kind of how I grew up to a point. But when I was about 10, all my friends started playing video games. And they stopped running around in the woods with me. They stopped being physically active. And I think that by and large, video games have been incredibly powerful in moving people away from physical activity. So a number of years ago, my friend Stefan Guillenet said to me, what it has done is they divorced flavor from nutrition, right? So you can get sweetness now without all the fiber, water, and phytochemicals in fruit. You can get, you can get bright colors, you can get all this stuff. You can make hyper-stimulating products with very little nourishment in them. And as soon as he said that, I thought to myself, well, this is just how you win at capitalism, late stage capitalism, because pornography is sexuality divorced from relationships where all the learning happens, right? And video games divorced from any physical capacity. So kids spend their time accessing their flow states, exercising just their thumbs. And I don't think that it's very powerful in the development of a human being generally. Now, a lot of kids have found parkour through Mirror's Edge or Assassin's Creed. But the amount of kids who would have been doing parkour naturally, not knowing what it was, before parkour is much higher, in my opinion, than the amount of kids who found parkour just through one of these things. So I'm very negative about video games in general. I didn't like them as a kid very much, and I was pretty upset when I couldn't get my friends to go run around in the woods again anymore with me when I reached a stage where everyone found video games. And I felt like, and I actually believe that my progression as an athlete was retarded by that, because I didn't have anyone to push me and to do things and to like go through adolescence running and jumping and climbing. So anyways, that's my background on it. So I haven't thought a lot about that. Generally, when I think about the future and augmented reality and VR and all those things, I just think, run as fast as you can away from this, right? I think the future, like, technology peaked in the 90s for me as far as affording human happiness, and everything that we've done since has been a mistake. So I may not be the most unbiased person thinking about this. And you probably disagree, Connor, and that's cool. You can find ways to hybridize these things and make them great together. But I'll point out all the ways that they might not work. Does that work for you?
The stimulation versus nourishment argument. Yeah, I agree with that generally. I just think that they also have the potential to move people in reverse as well, like you're saying, with people inspired by Mirror's Edge and so on. And whether they would have got into parkour without that, I mean, who knows, maybe not. But I think with augmented reality, that could be a new thing where it can be outdoors as well versus like a headset indoors. But yeah, we'll see. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a step in the right direction. It is a step in the right direction. But I don't know, I have a thing about authenticity, right? I want to be able to do things in the world as it is. So there we go.
Great. Thank you, Rafe, for being here, taking these questions. Yeah, I really appreciate this. I think there was a lot of rich comments, and yeah, for me, it's always exciting because anytime that I explore ideas about movement and play, the more curious I become about what might be possible. So I'm really glad that rather than like a sense of completion, I just feel more about like an intrigue about the possibilities. So that was just really exciting for me to have you here at the STOA, a place and a community that's become important to me. And you've been someone that's been influential and someone that I've really appreciated your work and admired you for your work. So thank you for being here. Thank you everyone for sharing this space with us.
Thanks guys, really appreciate it. It was really great to chat. And hopefully we'll do it again.
Yeah, guys, I'll plug an event for you as Peter requested. We have with Doug Tarrin, Emotive Framework, Live Emotional Processing. So some of you may be familiar with Doug. I don't know a whole lot, so I won't say much more. Other than that happens August 27th at 2:15 p.m. Eastern. So check out that event and have a beautiful rest of your day.
Adios, guys.
Peace.